Just before we get into today's video, just wanted to say a quick thank you to the historic city of Quincy, Massachusetts for teaming up with us yet again and sponsoring another of our The Story of America video series, covering so far everything from Amelia Earhart and the dawn of U.S. commercial aviation to the forgotten other guy who co-invented the telephone and helped make the U.S. a naval powerhouse, to the true story of the Amistad, to that time Ben Franklin and John Adams slept together and the hilarity that ensued, covering how those two men teamed up on multiple occasions to help create the United States, utilizing their own, rather diametrically and sometimes humorously opposed methods. As for Quincy, which yes, is pronounced Quincy, not Quincy, the city is home to the Adams National Historic Park, which preserves the home of Presidents John Adams and John Quincy Adams. In Quincy, you can explore the birthplaces of these iconic individuals and walk the same halls as they once did, immersing yourself in the beginnings of the United States. But Quincy isn't all about the past, it's a city that beautifully blends history with present-day adventures and experiences. From the iconic USS Salem to the stunning views of the Blue Hills and the architectural elegance of Old City Hall and the Thomas Crane Library, there's something here for everyone. And let's not forget the Epicurean delight that is Quincy's food scene, with an array of global and local flavors. It's a culinary journey that you can't miss. To discover more about what Quincy has in store for you, check out discoverquincy.com. It's time to step into history and create some unforgettable memories. Now let's get into today's video. There would not be, I believe, a happier being in the United States could I have just enough business to support my expenses so as to relieve me from the mortification of being at my time of life a burden to my parents. These were the words of the 23-year-old John Quincy Adams, tirelessly working in a profession he seemingly did not particularly enjoy, but making very little headway in it and dependent upon money from his parents to live. 4 years after this, he was now a 27-year-old who had not made a ton of outward progress despite an extreme amount of effort in between. As we teased in our last video, The Secretary, Training for Greatness, this period of one of the greatest men in US history's life was filled with bouts of depression, anxiety, countless sleepless nights, and a whole lot of hopelessness. Trained from birth to become that great man, and with it drilled into him he must become so, after he graduated college, he found achieving this seemingly an impossible task no matter how hard he worked. His aunt Elizabeth Shaw, who John Quincy would live with for a while during one of his deepest bouts of depression shortly after graduating college, would write of this period of her nephew's life, "Perhaps no one knew better than myself the strong emotions which tore and agitated your mind. I could have sat by your side and counted out tear for tear." And this was more or less the state of his life from about 20 to 27 years old. Needless to say, his first true steps into one of the greatest men of his era were slightly stumbling. But rather than break under the pressure, John Quincy merely bent for a time, unlike others in his family. On that, as John Quincy Adams' son, Charles Francis Adams, who himself led a rather distinguished life, among many other things, including serving as the U.S. minister to the UK during the American Civil War, and being a key figure in keeping Europe mostly out of that war, would sum up, "The history of my family is not a pleasant one to remember. It is one of great triumphs in the world, but of deep groans within, one of extraordinary brilliancy and deep corroding mortification. The misery of children falling as much below the ordinary standard of human conduct from vicious sensual indulgence as the gratification is worth of others to rise above it. I would not have any one of my children particularly distinguished at the price of such a penalty upon the rest. I would myself much rather remain beyond the sphere in which trial and temptation is so great." And indeed, at the age of 27, John Quincy had, as he'd briefly written many times before in moments of despair, resigned himself to give up on any notion of becoming particularly distinguished, despite continued extreme pressure from his parents, including a rather hard verbal slapping upside the head from his father, which we'll get into in a bit. But for now, in response to that verbal head slapping, on May 26, 1794, John Quincy would write to his dear old dad, "I think I have every day less ambition than the former. In my profession, I trudge along without eminence and without total idleness. I see very few things in this life beyond the wants of nature that I desire, and whether it be philosophy or insensibility, I find myself contented with my state as it is." 3 days later, probably even before John Adams would get that response, John Quincy's life, and much of history because of it, would change forever, seemingly out of nowhere. But in the lead up to that were the dark and hopeless years. Now, before we dive into those years and his various personal and professional struggles and efforts throughout, because John Quincy Adams is so unheralded in modern times despite paradoxically being one of the greatest and most influential men in US history, I think talking about a smattering of the truly mind-boggling number of things he did and even just experienced in his life is in order, because it's fascinating and incredible how much there is. Feel free to skip to the next section on his many dark, struggling years if you don't want your experiences in life to feel unaccomplished and generally inadequate in every possible way. Or maybe don't skip ahead because it's downright inspirational, the contrast between that almost decade-long dark period and then what followed. So, without further ado, let's dive into it all. As we outlined in our last video on John Quincy's childhood, this son of one of the nation's first power couples was from an otherwise humble farming community outside of Boston in Braintree, later renamed Quincy after John Quincy's great-grandfather, Colonel John Quincy. By virtue of his parents' role in the Revolution and formation of the United States, he would grow up socializing with the likes of George Washington, Ben Franklin, the Marquis de Lafayette, and Thomas Jefferson, and even for a time served as secretary and translator in Russia to US diplomat Francis Dana at the age of just 14, as well as not long after secretary to his father during the Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolution successfully. What we have not jumped into yet is as an adult, he would learn a lot more languages and serve with distinction as ambassador to the United States in half a dozen European nations, ultimately culminating in leading the negotiation that ended the so-called Second Revolution in the War of 1812. In the interim, he would rub elbows with many of the elite of Europe, such as leading academics like famed philosopher and founder of modern-day utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, who, by the way, had his body more or less taxidermied and put on display at University College London since, but back when his body was more animate, used to take long walks with John Quincy Adams discussing all manner of nerdery. Not stopping at academics, John Quincy also regularly mingled with the elite of various aristocracies, most notably developing a close relationship with Tsar Alexander I of Russia, including the Tsar even offering to become the godfather of John Quincy's daughter. While in Russia, John Quincy also witnessed firsthand Napoleon's disastrous invasion of that nation and would document in detail Napoleon's exploits, almost from the beginning of them through his downfall, as well as relay back to the US government on such happenings throughout Europe and his assessment of the various events and court intrigues. His wife Louisa even had a rather harrowing approximately 2,000-mile trip from Russia to join her husband in Paris when Napoleon escaped from Elba in the winter of 1815. In the process, she and the couple's child narrowly avoided being executed by the mobs in France, but through more than a bit of gumption and the occasional Viva Napoleon shouted from her very unfortunately Russian carriage, managed to make it past several such mobs safely. Barely. Speaking of witnessing and documenting significant moments in history, big and small, as a teen, the Junior Adams was also on hand to witness some of the first ever steps of man breaking the bonds of gravity. In this case, witnessing the first public launching of balloons in 1783, writing on August the 27th, "After dinner I went to see the experiment of the flying globe. A Mr. Montgolfier of late has discovered that if one fills a ball with inflammable air, much lighter than common air, the ball of itself will go up to an immense height of itself. This was the first public experiment of it at Paris. A subscription was opened some time agone and filled at once for making a globe. It was taffeta glued together with gum and lined with parchment, filled with inflammable air. It was of a spherical form and was 14-foot size in diameter. It was placed in the Champ de Mars at 5 o'clock. It rose at once for some time perpendicular and then slanted. The weather was unlucky, very cloudy, so that in less than 2 minutes it was out of sight. It went up very regularly and with great swiftness as soon as it was out of sight. This discovery is a very important one, and if it succeeds, it may become very useful to mankind." It would be just 1 month later that balloons carrying animals were launched, and a month after that carrying a human. His father would enthusiastically write of all of this a week after the first public demonstration, his intention to fly to his wife at 30 knots per hour by air if the devices were perfected before her arrival in Europe. A year later, the Junior Adams similarly pined for the perfection of this means of flight so he could take advantage of the speed achieved during various test flights, writing, "This is expeditious traveling, and I heartily wish they would bring balloons to such a perfection as that I might go to New York, Philadelphia, or Boston in 5 days' time." And to cap it all on the obscure history front, at one point later in life when opportunity struck, none other than famed author Charles Dickens shuffled his plans and busy schedule just so he could dine with the, at this point in life, rather legendary John Quincy Adams. Speaking of authors, on the side, John Quincy also wrote copious amounts of poetry, his real passion and explicit chosen profession if he'd had a choice in the matter, with his poem The Wants of Man even included in none other than Ralph Waldo Emerson's collection of favorite poems. Moving on from there to his more notable accomplishments, he served as a U.S. Senator, was unanimously elected to the U.S. Supreme Court, which he turned down, one of only 7 people in all of U.S. history to turn down such a position once their nomination was confirmed. Multiple times, he also successfully argued in front of the Supreme Court in everything from the landmark Fletcher versus Peck case, which was the first ever case in which the Supreme Court would overturn a state law as unconstitutional, to defending the rights of the captured Africans who revolted and killed their captors aboard the slave ship Amistad, only to find themselves captured again, this time locked up in jail in the United States. We have a full video on this one if you care to watch it, but in a nutshell, this slave ship revolt was all soon to be the center of an international affair, with strong pressure to ship the captured Africans off to Central America to either be executed or spend the rest of their lives as slaves. On the prosecution side were some rather powerful entities, including Spain, who put an incredible amount of international pressure on the United States, as well as the then president of the US, Martin Van Buren, whose administration John Quincy Adams seemingly correctly accused before Congress of illegally falsifying documents in the case to try to aid the Spanish side against the captured Africans. At one point, President Van Buren even had a ship waiting to deport the captives immediately after one of the trials to help forego any practical chance of appeal. On the other side, defending the Africans in front of the Supreme Court, packed with several slave-owning judges, was John Quincy Adams and future Connecticut Governor Roger Baldwin. Working pro bono, Adams and Baldwin leveraged various hard legal arguments, as well as Adams, as ever, pushing to make the Declaration of Independence a guiding document for the nation, something Abraham Lincoln and co. would later successfully solidify. But in this case, Adams arguing to the Supreme Court, "I know of no law but one which I am not at liberty to argue before the court. No law, statute, or constitution, no code, no treaty applicable to the proceedings of the executive or the judiciary except that law." He then pointed to the copy of the Declaration of Independence hanging against one of the pillars. The moment you come to the Declaration of Independence, that every man has a right to life and liberty, an inalienable right, this case is decided. I ask nothing more on behalf of these unfortunate men than this declaration. In the end, in a 7-1 decision, the Supreme Court ruled, "There does not seem to us to be any ground for doubt that these Negroes ought to be deemed free, and that the Spanish Treaty interposes no obstacle to the just assertion of their rights." Beyond all this, Adams variously served as a professor of rhetoric and oratory at Harvard and a professor of logic at Brown on the side, because sure, why not? Who needs downtime? Moving on from there, as we're going to dive into in upcoming videos in this series in fascinating detail, he also served as the US Secretary of State under President James Monroe, in the process being the principal architect of what would become known as the Monroe Doctrine, which unequivocally announced to the world that the new nation would no longer tolerate direct interference from the old world with budding nations in the new world, and was ultimately one of the key guiding documents of US foreign policy then to now. While secretary, he also negotiated everything from the famed Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, which saw Spain cede Florida to the United States, as well as set the border between the US and Mexico. And shortly before setting the then southern border of the United States, Adams also helped with the northern border as a part of the Convention of 1818, which, among other things, began the demilitarization between British North America and the United States, and set the border at the 49th parallel up through Oregon Territory, with the latter now being shared with Britain uncontested. In all, marking a major positive shift in British and US relations that has mostly continued unabated since. As former managing editor of the Adams Family Papers at the Massachusetts Historical Society, Margaret A. Hogan would sum up of Adams's work as Secretary of State. As a diplomat, he set the essential marks of American foreign policy for the next century: freedom of the seas, a halt to further European colonization in the Western Hemisphere, continental expansion, reciprocal trade, and isolationism from European affairs. His formidable skills as an international diplomat ushered in 2 generations of peace with Europe. And then for kicks and giggles, he went ahead and became President of the United States, as his parents had long ago explicitly stated they expected of him, yet was somehow one of the least productive periods of his career. Not because he didn't have great ideas, many of which would later be implemented after his presidency by others since, but most of which were shot down at the time. As to why, this was primarily stemming from things like his unwillingness to kowtow to party politics, long since, while technically belonging to one party or another at different times, on the whole just doing what he felt was right regardless of what his current party thought. Something that cost him a Senate seat early in his career when he did such things as support the Louisiana Purchase against his party's wishes until they ousted him. While he was then courted by the other side to join their ranks, at the time he mostly shunned that party's advances as well, generally preferring to remain a party of one in practice, if not always in membership. He states of this mindset, "My career has attached no party to me precisely because it has been independent of all party, and the consequences has been that all parties disown me. I have followed the convictions of my own mind with a single eye, that of the interests of the whole nation." The southern states were also largely against him during his presidency, both because many felt he was a secret abolitionist, and indeed he would spend the majority of his later life in the fight against slavery, though has ever generally avoided joining any such group officially, but also because he allegedly only defeated the South's chosen candidate in Andrew Jackson for the presidency owing to a corrupt bargain with Henry Clay. That said, we have an about 2-hour-long documentary on this, with the summation being, all evidence seems to be that the corrupt bargain was an invention of Andrew Jackson himself after one of his constituents seemingly tried to make such a corrupt bargain for Jackson with Clay and his friends. In the end, Jackson's twisted version of events making Adams and his friends the conspirators instead of his own supporters was pushed both to justify his loss in the immediate aftermath and ultimately to help in his rematch against Adams 4 years later. Jackson didn't lose, you see. The election was stolen from him by the elite in power. The irony being, once again, many of the accusations from his camp of corruption and the like were seemingly actually things his own group were doing, including the alleged attempt at the corrupt bargain. See our ultra deep dive on the whole saga for much, much more. And noteworthy, even when speaking of Jackson technically having won the Electoral College, he only did so barely, and by taking advantage of the 3/5 compromise, allowing him to essentially count part of the non-voting slave population as if they'd voted for him in determining the number of electorates. And if you're wondering what Jackson's stance on slavery was, well, beyond owning a few hundred people, Jackson once published in the Tennessee Gazette offering anyone who found one of his runaway slaves to, quote, $10 extra for every 100 lashes any person will give him, up to 300 lashes. Note, that amount would almost certainly have been fatal. In another instance, one of his slaves named Betty was deemed to have behaved improperly, and thus he ordered his overseer that she, to quote, must be ruled with the cowhide, and that further, if she ever stepped out of line again, to give her 50 lashes for every single instance. So, call us crazy, but we're guessing the slaves in the slave states, had they been given the right to vote, would have been more likely to vote for a man in Adams who felt, to quote Adams, "For what can be more false and heartless than the doctrine which makes the first and holiest rights of humanity to depend on the color of the skin?" But in a nutshell, the 3/5 compromise was the result of the slave states wanting to count the individuals they held as slaves in their population with regards to factors such as the number of seats in the House of Representatives and Electoral College votes and the like. On the other side, the slave states did not want to have their slave populations counted when it came to taxation of their states. Ultimately, a middle ground was decided upon wherein 3/5 of the slave population of these states would count in these matters, given the slave states extra seats in Congress and in the Electoral College, while reducing their tax bill slightly from what it would be if all the total slave population was accurately represented. Thus, if you remove the extra Electoral College votes that were the result of this 3/5 compromise from all the candidates, the total stood at 83 votes for Adams and 77 for Jackson. Granted, at the time the 3/5 compromise counted, so Jackson and his followers did have right to be a little sore that he had technically won the Electoral College, but not enough to not let Congress become involved. And well, Congress had much, much more faith in the cool and collected John Quincy Adams with his vast experience, extreme integrity, and almost unparalleled intellect than the rather unpredictable hothead in Andrew Jackson, who was just as likely to shoot you if you felt you'd slighted him as respond reasonably. We'll have some fun videos on all that later in the year. Andrew Jackson was an interesting person. Going back to Adams, he did not help himself as president either by filling his cabinet in various prominent political positions with many of his enemies, some of whom openly worked against him and his policies. As to why he would choose them, Adams simply felt that if someone was the best or most experienced for a given job in government, they should have that job regardless of whether they agreed with his own politics or ideas, to the extent that he even tried to make Andrew Jackson his Secretary of War, a position Jackson naturally turned down, still having his eye on the next presidency and not wanting to be associated with the Adams administration. But again, Adams had been drilled from childhood to always do what he deemed the right thing, regardless of whether it was of personal benefit to himself or the opposite. Needless to say, because of his unwillingness to play the party game, many in his administration actively working against him, but Adams refusing to fire them for it, to the exasperation of many of his supporters, and generally being perceived as pushing national policy over states, as well as his burgeoning opposition to slavery, many of his efforts as president were resoundingly thwarted. These included pushing such things as the establishment of a national university, a national astronomical observatory, something he was widely mocked for, a naval academy, a uniform weights and measure system, which note he heavily favored the then relatively new metric system, the establishment of the Department of the Interior for overseeing a massive number of internal improvements, such as better documentation and exploration of the country's lands and resources, and creating improved means of transport throughout, from roads and canals to railroads, all with the hope of bolstering commerce as well as for better national unity between states. Note, the first passenger railroad in the US was established during his presidency. He also, among other things, attempted to establish a national bankruptcy law to help protect the liberties of private citizens and smooth out the entire process to the benefit of all, as previous systems that could include jailing debtors really were not beneficial to anyone, even those trying to collect on the debts. Kinda hard to pay people back when sitting in jail, and the result was also generally catastrophic for the individual's family as well. And noteworthy of this, at the time of his presidency, the majority of people in jail in the United States were there because of debts. The list goes on and on and on. Many great ideas, but few in Congress or beyond willing to support them because they came from Adams. Speaking of the people beyond, that's not to mention Adams's extremely high-minded and high-sounding speeches and way of communicating did not exactly resonate with the largely uneducated masses. As one historian, George Dangerfield, would sum up of Adams's presidency, Adams was, to quote, a rather conspicuous example of a great man in the wrong place at the wrong time with the right motives and a tragic inability to make himself understood. As for a potential second term as president, as had been mostly tradition up to this point, but had recently starkly changed, Adams was unwilling to do pretty much anything but say he'd accept the position if elected again, refusing to campaign at all because, to quote him, this mode of electioneering suited neither my taste nor my principles. And further, of turning down every single invitation to come campaign in various states and events, he would write of his refusal, from cattle shows to other public meetings for purposes of utility or exposure of public sentiment, the transition is natural and easy. This is no part of my duty. He goes on, my journeys and my visits wherever they may be shall have no connection with the presidency. This would all leave both his supporters as well as his wife Louisa exasperated, with many giving up on continuing to argue with Adams over this and instead turning to his wife to try to convince him. On all this, she would at one point lament if he would only lend himself a little to the usages and manners of the people without hiding himself and rejecting their civilities, no man could be more popular because his manners are simple, unostentatious, and unassuming. This was, after all, a man who was being presented by his political enemies as a corrupt, elitist aristocrat who had been corrupted by the extravagant courts of Europe, who in reality dressed in often worn, cheap, homespun clothes, avoided pageantry like the plague, enjoyed frequently eating simple plain crackers for meals instead of fancy dinners, and who one of his favorite activities was to sit at home by himself and study his Bible, which he felt was important to read at minimum once a year from cover to cover. In response to his wife and others' entreatments, he would counter how, in his view, reprehensible the idea of campaigning for office and strong party affiliation is, as well as outline the corruption he felt that mode of electioneering would always result in, stating, the principle of the Constitution in its purity is that the duty shall be assigned to the most able and most worthy. Politicians and newspapers may bestir themselves to point out who that is, and the only question between us is whether it be consistent with the duties of a citizen to assist, countenance, and encourage those who are disposed to befriend him in the pursuit. The law of friendship is a reciprocation of good offices. He who asks or accepts the offer of friendly service contracts the obligation of meeting it with a suitable return. He who asks or accepts the offer of aid to promote his own views necessarily finds himself to promote the views of him from where he receives it. Whatever may be the wishes of an individual, nothing but the unbiased voice of many others can make him even a candidate for the chief magistracy. If he asks or accepts for the aid of one, he must ask or accept for the aid of multitudes. Between the principle of which much has been said in the newspapers, that a president of the United States must remember those to whom he owes his elevation, and the principle of accepting no aid on the score of friendship or personal kindness to him, there is no alternative. The former, as it has been announced and urged, I deem to be essentially and vitally corrupt. The latter is the only principle to which no exception can be taken. And in summation, he states, I have followed the convictions of my own mind with a single eye, that of the interests of the whole nation. If I am to be a candidate, it must be by the wishes of others, not by mine. If my countrymen prefer others to me, I must not repine at their choice. Indifference at the heart is not to be won by the loudest trumpet. Merit and just right in this country will be heard. And in my case, if they are not heard without my stir, I shall acquiesce in the conclusion that it is because they do not exist. In other words, he'd be elected by his own merits alone or not at all. Campaigning for office in support of himself or against any other was something he would not do, nor would he ask for or personally accept help from anyone in being elected, lest he then feel obligated to reciprocate a favor when president. Needless to say, his high-minded principles were both extremely laudable and also extremely ineffective given the way elections had changed at this point in history. He thus lost his half-hearted bid for a second term resoundingly to Andrew Jackson at 178 to 83 in the Electoral College, though somewhat closer in the popular vote at 55.5% for Jackson and 44% for Adams. Now, most who serve as president have that more or less the endpoint of the highlight of their professional careers. With John Quincy Adams, this was quite the opposite. He was just getting started. After all, as we covered in depth in our last video, The Secretary Training for Greatness, his parents had taught him from birth the whole purpose of his life was to be both productive and to serve his nation, and he had a lot of life left to go. He sums up shortly after losing his bid for a second term, "The North assails me for my fidelity to the Union, the South for my ardent aspirations of improvement. Yet bate I not a jot of heart and hope. Passion, prejudice, envy, and jealousy will pass. The cause of the Union and of improvement will remain, and I have duties to it and to my country yet to discharge." Thus, he spent the next about 2 decades of his life tirelessly fighting for the abolition of slavery despite constant death threats, and that, in the beginning at least, it was almost him against the rest of Congress on this issue, something he could rather uniquely pull off so openly because his election each term on the home front was so secure regardless of what he did or said, and regardless of the fact that he still refused to campaign. He simply was too well known and well respected, even ultimately by many of his political enemies. They might have disagreed with his politics, but his extreme integrity, insanely broad and deep scholarship, and breadth of accomplishments were almost unparalleled in history up to that point in the United States, and pretty much everyone knew it. In the process of the fight, John Quincy Adams managed in some quite hilarious ways at times to find ways to skirt or push the limits of the gag rule against talking about slavery in Congress, culminating at one point in Congress threatening to chuck him out, ultimately with an accusation of treason no less, only to see him quite happy about the whole thing, even though during it only 2 of his fellow Massachusetts contemporaries in Congress would overtly defend Adams in it. It was once again Adams against the rest of Congress, but you see, Adams had been intentionally antagonizing his fellow congressmen, using one of his favorite tricks of baiting his opposition and then turning it all around to be a discussion on slavery. In this case, the defense of himself would allow him to really speak his mind and have the floor mostly unhindered, and allow him to annoy the crap out of the opposition as he constantly kept dragging things out and making everyone who tried to debate him look like an idiot until they quite literally just gave up on the whole affair and let him continue to do his thing. It turns out going up against a literal professor of rhetoric, oratory, and logic who had been schooled almost from birth by some of the most distinguished minds of the generation, and then doubled down with many decades of experience and further learning, and who resoundingly had the moral high ground not just on slavery, but also things like freedom of speech and the right to petition government, isn't a great way to come out looking good. In a nutshell, in the fight, John Quincy was the proverbial Aslan to the witch queen.
Do not cite the deep magic to me, witch. I was there when it was written.
You better believe we have some videos upcoming on this fight because it's phenomenal and even extremely humorous at points on some of the ways John Quincy antagonized his opponents, along with an occasional mic drop he delivered during the debates. But summing up his fight against slavery, he writes in one of his many poems, "Who but shall learn that freedom is the prize man still is bound to rescue or maintain, that nature's God commands the slave to rise, and on the oppressor's head to break the chain. Roll years of promise rapidly roll around, till not a slave shall on this earth be found." In the end, many of his arguments before and after the gag rule was lifted, largely thanks to his efforts, were the foundation for what Lincoln, a young senator alongside John Quincy Adams towards the end of Adams's life, and his cohorts would go on to do not long after John Quincy's death. As for that, fittingly for a man whose entire life was dedicated to his nation, Adams's last moments of consciousness in this world were spent on the floor of Congress. Standing to argue a point, after only a few words, he suddenly collapsed and would die 2 days later on February the 23rd, 1848. This all was, however, seemingly just the way he'd have wanted to leave the world, writing some 7 years before his death. "More than 60 years of incessant active intercourse with the world has made political movement to me as much a necessary of life as atmospheric air. This is the weakness of my nature, which I have intellect enough left to perceive, but not energy to control. And thus, while a remnant of physical power is left me to write and speak, the world will retire from me before I shall retire from the world." But John Quincy's contributions to history did not end here. He had one last gift to give the world, throughout his life documenting everything as an eyewitness or active participant in a huge number of pivotal moments in not just the American Revolution, but world events in between that and leading all the way to the eve of the Civil War. In all, over 14,000 pages of his diary, which he started at the age of 10 at the command of his father. Importantly, John Adams not only asked his son to document everything, but also in it to be brutally honest and introspective in what he wrote, a notion John Quincy would, in turn, pass on to his son George Washington Adams on November the 28th, 1827, writing of the practice of journaling that if you weren't accurate in it, it was probably a reflection that your conduct was poor, as, to quote, "A man who commits to paper from day to day the employment of his time, the places he frequents, the persons with whom he converses, the actions with which he is occupied, will have a perpetual guard over himself. His record is a second conscience. He will fly from worthless associates and from dishonest deeds to avoid the alternative of becoming a self-accuser or of falsifying by the suppression of his own testimony to his own actions." Needless to say, while if you watched our previous video in this series, the aforementioned, the Secretary Training for Greatness, you'll have seen the incredible amount of pressure that was put on the young man to excel, even to the presidency, he somehow managed to surpass it all, reaching a height of influence and accomplishment few in history have ever matched. So now that we all feel worse about ourselves, our meager accomplishments, and likewise inadequate life experiences, let's now finally do a deep dive into when John Quincy Adams felt the same about himself to his core. As noted, before all this excessive achievement and making the rest of us look bad, well, before this, John Quincy Adams was just an exceptionally socially awkward, freshly graduated college student and, after a few years studying law, lawyer, with no great prospects. As he writes, "I have no fortune to expect from any part, and the profession is so much crowded that I have no prospects of securing myself by it for several years after I begin." And because of all this, throughout it all, he was on the verge of a mental breakdown from all the pressure, but with no clue how to fulfill the expectations drilled into him from birth. And to understand the full impossibility of his situation, it's important to explicitly point out that in order to fulfill those great expectations put upon him, he needed to somehow do it all of his own merit. Yet he was well aware any advancements towards those ends that were expected of him would be interpreted by many in the general public and others as having ridden on the coattails of his father and by his influence or name. Whether that was true or not in reality was ultimately irrelevant. Thus, he somehow had to walk an almost impossible to achieve path, but also even more impossibly do it completely free from his father's rather long shadow that pretty much covered the entire nation, owing to the fact that his father had been arguably one of the top 5 individuals to have created said nation in the first place, and oh by the way, was now second only to George Washington in leading it and likely to succeed Washington in the highest office should Washington ever step down. In the midst of this, he would write near his graduation from Harvard on his 21st birthday, "This day completes my 20th year, and yet I am good for nothing, and cannot even carry myself forward in the world. 3 long years I have yet to study in order to qualify myself for business, and then, oh, how many more years to plod along mechanically, if I should live, before I shall really get into the world. I sicken at the very idea. Thus is 1/3 of a long life employed in preparing to act a part during another third, and the last is to be passed in rest and quiet, waiting for the last stroke which places us just where we were 70 years before. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. He didn't exactly brighten up the next day, writing, "For my own part, I have spent my time this day as usual. I have even discarded thought and live more like any of the domestic animals than like a man." His vexation and distress would ultimately not just leak out into his journal, but in the most John Quincy Adams way of also writing an essay, a youth about to enter the scenes of active life, read in front of the Phi Beta Kappa Society at Harvard, a slightly ironic speech about a young man stressing about being unlikely to ever achieve great notoriety, attended by some of the most distinguished people of the region, including none other than John Hancock, all of whom were interested to hear what this particular stressed out young man had to say. Which, by the way, if you haven't yet, do go check out our 5-part Hancock series. It's a fascinating deep dive into one of the most forgotten and critical igniters of the revolution, a man without whom there may not have been one, or at least not a successful one. But going back to Adams's speech, the summation was of confronting the prospect of mediocrity as well as a contrasting, fantastic dream. He states in part of the future for such a young man, "We are often prone to view the distant objects through the deceptive medium of fancy or of the passions. We soar rapidly upon the wings of flattering imagination and soon lose ourselves bewildered amidst the magnificent objects with which we have adorned the road around us. Unmindful of the precarious tenure by which all human enjoyments are held, we behold fortune and fame emulously striving to invest us in the possession of all the blessings which they can impart. But that in reality, the path of life becomes rugged with thorns, 1,000 obstacles apparently stand before us, and the approach to the seats of happiness, like that to the Garden of Hesperides, seems under the perpetual custody of fiery dragons. We dwell with involuntary terror upon the ideas of malice, the treachery and envy which we expect from our fellow mortals until we are ready to imagine that our life is to be a state of continual warfare with the whole human race. The baseless fabric of our hopes vanishes like the phantom of a fairy tale, and the mind oppressed by the contemplation of these gloomy objects is almost ready to settle in a state of sullen despondency. And that it is only through extreme trials and tribulations that a person can reach such heights. He states, "Great honors, we must remember, are the reward of great exertions. The reputation of statesman or a warrior is generally proportioned to the distresses from which he relieved or attempted to relieve his country." After giving this speech, the rather despondent young man returned home and sunk into an even deeper depression, suffering from occasional bouts of insomnia at night and struggling to do anything in the day, a rather severe affliction for someone who'd been taught from birth to be productive with all the time you're given. He writes in his diary on February the 10th, 1788 of this, "My spirits for some time have been low, and I have felt an incapacity of enjoyment, but that is now wearing off, and I am in hopes that before long I shall again be able to resume at least as much diligence as I have been used to." It did not wear off forever, however, and he finally decided to take something of a sabbatical. Rather than return home to Braintree, where he'd have to face his parents and their expectations, in September of 1788 he went the other way, going to stay with his aforementioned Aunt Elizabeth Shaw in Haverhill, an outwardly peculiar move which his loving aunt made excuses for by writing to Abigail that Braintree was too far, and if he can get what he wants, a little kind attention nearer, it would not be worth his while. She also wrote, "Mr. Adams came here Saturday to experience a little of my maternal care, that he is unwell, etc., but lest you should hear of it and be too anxious, I will tell you that I hope he will be better in a few days. He has not been well since he left Braintree. What did you do to him? Did you give him too strong coffee and green tea, or did you read to him some woeful story? He cannot sleep at night, and his nervous system seems much affected. If I can coax him to sleep tonight, I shall feel quite grateful, for he has not rested 2 nights together for some time." As to her assessment of what was ailing him, she writes, "I am afraid he has applied himself too closely to his studies. He is so avaricious in coveting the best gifts that I fear such intense application will injure his health more than he is aware of." His cousin Lucy Cranch had also written to Abigail with the same concerns a couple years before, stating, "We sometimes fear that he will injure his health by his very great attention to his studies. He is determined to be great in every particular." Even Abigail herself, who had once pushed her son so hard, began to rethink things, as John Adams would to an extent later in life as well, concerning the pressure for greatness they'd put on their sons, even chiding John Quincy for partially doing the same to his own children, with Abigail writing a year previous to John Quincy's mini breakdown, "I fear a little that my eldest son will be so much of a bookworm and scholar that he will grow too negligent of those attentions which are due to the world, and which, though they may appear little and trifling, much of our happiness is found by experience to depend upon them." Likewise, Abigail's sister Mary would ring in that same year shortly before his graduation. "He looked so pale and wan when he came home this spring that I was not a little alarmed about him. He has lost so much flesh within these 9 months that I have been obliged to take in his waistcoats a full quarter of a yard. His complaints are wholly owing to want of air and exercise and too great an attention to his studies. His food does not digest well. I am continually urging upon him the necessity of more exercise. I have got Dr. Tufts to talk very plainly to him and tell him what his fate will be unless he pursues a different method." As for fixing the issues, his Aunt Elizabeth dutifully attempted to nurse the young man back to health with such remedies as quinine and valerian tea, writing, "He is the best man to take his medicine that I ever saw. He hardly makes a wry mouth." And otherwise, she attempted to provide a sympathetic ear to talk with on all manner of things. As partially referenced earlier, Shaw would write to her nephew on June the 9th, 1794, summing up all the times he'd come to her for some maternal support, "When I have beheld you nobly struggling with those tender passions which few at your age would have thought of contending with, and seeing you sacrificing your own inclinations to situation and filial duty, my heart has honored and paid a silent tribute to your merit. I knew that your health suffered, and indeed I feared you would have fallen victim to the strength of your reason and your frozen judgment. Perhaps no one knew better than myself the strong emotions which tore and agitated your mind. I could have sat by your side and counted out tear for tear. I longed to lighten your heart and to have you pour out all your grief into my feeling, faithful bosom." As she alluded to there, also during this time, the junior Adams was struggling with another affliction, women. In particular, by the spring of 1789, he had settled on one in Mary Fraser, daughter of a merchant, Moses Fraser, who he fell ardently in love with, and seemingly the feeling was mutual. Adams would write to a friend, James Bridge of Mary, "You may know, though it is known to very few, that all my hopes of future happiness in this life center in that girl." However, his mother would quickly put the kibosh on this when she learned of it. In a letter expounding upon her own illness and the lengths she had nonetheless been going to make sure he was taken care of with money, as well as hay and wood, she then dove into the real point of her letter. "When I have more strength, I will write to you upon a subject that gives me some anxiety. Common fame reports that you are attached to a young lady. I am sorry such a report should prevail. An entanglement of this kind will only tend to depress your spirits should you be any time before you get into business. And believe me, my dear son, a too early marriage will involve you in troubles that may render you and yours unhappy the remainder of your life. Why gain the affections of a woman, or why give her cause to think you attached to her? In a nutshell, that his prospects, to quote, are not such as can warrant you in entering into any entanglement, and that I will give you one piece of advice: never form connections until you see a prospect of supporting a family." As for this message, John Quincy would simply write in his journal after reading it, "Letter from my mother," curiously underlining those words for some reason, one might presume in anger. Whatever the case, continue focusing on his work and betterment, and put an end to his relationship with Mary Fraser was essentially her and his father's order. John Quincy, however, tried for a middle road. While he did indeed dutifully focus on his career, moving to Boston after finishing his legal training and opening up a law office there on Court Street, he also secretly proposed to Mary, though with the stipulation that their engagement must remain secret until such a time as he had built up his practice to a level to support a wife and a family. What happened next is partially lost to history, not the least of which because John Quincy seems to have burned many of his letters and the like surrounding Mary shortly before leaving the United States in 1794. Rather curious for a man who so openly and meticulously documented for posterity the majority of his life and even personal faults and mistakes. That said, such emotions and ardent romantic passions were otherwise mostly devoid of his life from then on, and it's perhaps not surprising from this that one of the only other times he wished letters of his to be concealed from posterity were ones in which he opened up about his romantic feelings. For example, in August of 1822, he writes to his wife Louisa, "The first woman I ever loved was an actress, but I never spoke to her, and I think never saw her off the stage. She belonged to a company of children who performed at the Bois de Boulogne near Passy when I lived there with Dr. Franklin and my father. She remains upon my memory as the most lovely and delightful actress that I ever saw. But I have not seen her since I was 14. She was then about the same age. Of all the ungratified longings that I ever suffered, that of being acquaintance with her, merely to tell her how much I adored her, was the most intense. I was tortured with this desire for nearly 2 years, but never had the wit to compass it. I used to dream of her for at least 7 years after." He then concludes, "I have burnt none of your journals and shall keep them all. I do not even ask you to burn this or any other of my letters, but I entreat you not to mislay them or let them get into any other hands than your own. Consider with what ineffable ridicule you would cover me if you should suffer my confession of my first love to get abroad, and how I never told my love, but let concealment, like a woman in the bud, prey on my damask cheek." But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Going back to his secret proposal, Mary refused unless he would agree to make the engagement official and very public, perhaps at the behest of her family, as Adams would later write of her refusal, "Her wrong to me, which indeed never originated with herself, I freely forgave at the moment when I resigned her affections." In the end, he could not defy the wishes of his parents in favor of the wishes of his heart, and seemingly neither could she. This was all, however, something he would throw some jabs at his mother about later when he was courting Louisa, who Abigail did not approve of either. On this one, Abigail had the gumption at that time to suggest instead of focusing on Louisa, he should inquire as to the status and feelings of his former love, Mary Fraser, who was still unengaged. And further, in perhaps a small bout of selective amnesia, Abigail seemed to imply that the push for John Quincy's breaking it off with Mary before had been all his father's idea. More on this in our next video in the series. But for now, as noted, John Quincy did break it off with Mary and even at times expressed appreciation for what his parents had done here. For example, in a letter to a friend writing he had been lucky to escape the, to quote, "web in which my own heedless passion had precipitated me." And that at that point in August of 1794, I hear her name mentioned without an emotion, I see her without a throb of the heart, I speak to her without faltering of the voice. But I remember that I have loved her with an affection surpassing that of women, and there are few circumstances in the compass of human events that would afford me more sincere pleasure than I should receive upon being informed that she has become the happy wife of another man. In stark contrast, however, he would occasionally lament his decision, or perhaps the necessity of it, including all the way at the age of 71, writing she was, "to me, the most beautiful and the most beloved of her sex." And further, "Dearly, how dearly did the sacrifice of her cost me, voluntary as it was, for the separation was occasioned by my declining to contract an unqualified engagement, forbidden by my father and by the advice of her cousin to her to insist upon a positive engagement or a separation. 4 years of exquisite wretchedness followed this separation, nor was the wound in my bosom healed till the Atlantic Ocean flowed between us." Noteworthy, 2 of his siblings would face similar issues with their parents on the choice of their respective spouses and ultimately defied their wishes. But for John Quincy, the woman he loved pushed to the side, he soldiered on, trying to figure out a way to first support himself without the aid of his parents, then, you know, the small step from there to become president of the United States. Going back to his career, we should probably also mention things did not exactly start out well on that lawyering front when, in his first ever court case, he froze and couldn't manage to get the words to come out of his mouth for a bit. He, as ever, however, diligently continued to try to shut everything else out and focus on his work, spending many days late at his office studying or otherwise trying to make headway in his profession, with his principal amusements being walks or dinners with friends. It was during all this he occasionally references making a repetitive, lamentable mistake, though what this was isn't clear today, other than a few dozen instances of him mentioning it after one of his late night walks, and generally using the same terms to describe it, as well as the same term to describe when he was tempted towards whatever end, but managed to avoid it. For example, on September the 3rd, 1792, did wrong not to go to the exhibition, walking in the mall all eve, fortunately unsuccessful. In another instance, mall, I got fortunately home. And another, as before, idleness instigates to everything bad, and oh shame, where is thy blush, late home. Or in another, evening at my office, foolish adventure afterwards, discretion prevailed. Or on June the 20th of 1793, walking with Fraser in the evening, met Gardner and 2 ladies, but made a lamentable mistake again. There is a fatality in it, I think. And yet again, on September the 7th, 1793, Walk in the Mall returned with Jarvis and Gardner to Fraser's afterwards, to supper, then a foolish but fortunate walk. In yet another, on September the 28th, 1792, he writes, Walked in the evening, nothing to do. My employment seems to be in an inverse proportion to the attention which merits it. Smallpox, not my only evil. As for what he's referencing here, this isn't clear, even after, as we did, reading literally every single journal entry he had for this span of years and trying to flesh out every instance of this evil and times when he was fortunate versus made a lamentable mistake. And note here, these mentions were rare, whatever they were. Some, such as historian James Traub in his aforementioned excellent book John Quincy Adams, Militant Spirit, suggest the young man was struggling with desires which pretty much every young human does, particularly around that age. Thus, Traub suggests John Quincy was finding himself in these instances walking beyond his normal areas and into what we might call today the red light district, and, if this speculation is correct, in a handful of instances failing to resist temptation and soliciting the services of one of these women. That said, given lack of any clear evidence and the extremely rigid morals the Adamses clung to, others find this interpretation somewhat suspect. After all, this was a man whose father had spent a large percentage of the first 15 years of marriage, including at one point 5 consecutive years apart from his wife, in that case in the heart of a region known for its flexibility in such matters, but nonetheless stayed steadfastly loyal to his partner throughout it all. Writing later in life, he was proud that unlike so many of his contemporaries, no virgin or matron ever had cause to blush at the sight of me or to regret her acquaintance with me. No father, brother, son, or friend ever had cause for grief or resentment for any intercourse between me and any daughter, sister, mother, or any other relation of the female sex. My children may be assured that no illegitimate brother or sister exists or ever existed. And all other evidence seems to be John Quincy was an apple that did not fall far from the tree of his father's example. Others have suggested this struggle at the time may have been what so many others in his family had struggled with in times of stress and beyond: alcohol and getting drunk. In the end, when it came to John Quincy, the smallest flaw in his nature or actions often elicited such self-lamentations, right down to using similar descriptive words to chide himself for the great evil, in his view, of idleness. In a nutshell, not being productive with every free moment given to him. Thus, it could have been all manner of things he was referencing. However, given his failure to ever explicitly name it, it at least certainly was something he was particularly ashamed of, given how candid he normally was in his journal when being self-critical. In this case, he was adhering to still making sure to write down his perceived mistakes, but too embarrassed to name it explicitly. Whatever was going on there, again and again here, we see this wasn't exactly a happy time for the future great man. His mother would aptly sum up of it all to her sister Mary on March the 12th, 1791. He appears to have lost much of his sprightliness and vivacity. He says that the want of business in his profession and the dismal prospect for the practitioners of the law in Massachusetts is the weight which depresses him, and that he should still be obliged at his age to be dependent upon his parents for a support. Although these feelings are proof of a good mind and a sensible heart, I could wish that they did not oppress him so much. He wishes sometimes that he had been bred a farmer, a merchant, or in anything by which he could earn his bread, but we all preach patience to him. Not long after this, on April 2nd, 1791, he described how one of his friends who had had similar expectations of greatness had decided to give up on such hopes and was the happier for it. By May 16th, 1791, John Quincy had decided to do the same, accept mediocrity, and instead of striving towards his greater ambitions, to simply attempt, to quote him, at least a respectable reputation. Things would not greatly improve in his musings the following year, in May of 1792, when he would still have his mind forever spinning in his diary on the subject. In this case stating, "I am not satisfied with the manner in which I employ my time. It is calculated to keep me forever fixed in that state of uselessness and disgraceful insignificancy which has been my lot for some years past. At an age bearing close upon 25, when many of the characters who were born for the benefit of their fellow creatures have rendered themselves conspicuous among their contemporaries and founded a reputation upon which their memory remains and will continue to the latest posterity, at that period I still find myself as obscure as unknown to the world, as the most indolent or the most stupid of human beings. In the walks of active life I have done nothing. Mildly humorously, rather than give up in this case, as he at other times would do as noted, he yet again goes about being the most John Quincy Adams who ever John Quincy Adams, meticulously analyzing others and most importantly himself, the way he spends his time and even his very fundamental principles, searching for defects and ways to improve, as well as to separate out things that are within his power to control and things which are not, to try to find a way. Including such gems as, if my time should be loitered away in stupid laziness, it will be under the full conviction of my conscience that I am basely bartering the greatest benefits with which human beings can be indulged for the miserable gratifications which are hardly worthy of contributing to the enjoyments of the brute creation. And as for his profession, he writes, I have grounded myself upon the principle that my character is, under the smiles of heaven, to be the work of my own hands. It becomes necessary for me to determine upon what part of active or of speculative life I mean to rest my pretensions to eminence. My own situation and that of my country equally prohibit me from seeking to derive any prescient expectations from a public career. My disposition is not military, and happily the warlike talents are not those which open the most pleasing or the most reputable avenue to fame. I have had some transient thoughts of undertaking some useful literary performance, but the pursuit would militate at present too much with that of the profession upon which I am to depend, not only for my reputation, but for my subsistence. I have therefore concluded that the most proper object of my present attention is that profession itself, and in acquiring the faculty to discharge the duties of it in a manner suitable to my own wishes and to the expectations of my friends. I find ample room for close and attentive application, for frequent and considerate observation, and for such benefits of practical experience as occasional opportunities may throw my way. So at least he'd finally come around to law having been a good choice for a career. And believe me, if you've read the several years of journal entries from this period from him, this is a marked improvement. But around and around and around he went with himself, and 2 years later, nothing much had changed. He laments in February of 1794, though advanced almost to the age of 30, I have no political existence, and my ideas of liberty and government are so wildly distant from the fashion of the day that they are much more likely to be injurious than beneficial to my advancement. At the bar, after nearly 4 years' practice, I remain obscure and unknown, without any expectation of brilliant success, and scarcely with the hope of obtaining with all the industry in the power of man, and with integrity unblemished, even a decent subsistence. Surely then, as far as success in the criterion of talents, I have no reason to be vain. My greatest fear for myself at present is that I shall grow too easy, careless, and indolent. But it was all about to change, rapidly and shockingly to the man himself, though not so to his father, who just a month before John Quincy wrote that preceding text, wrote to Abigail stating his absolute faith in his son that it was only a matter of time because his talents, his virtues, his studies, and his writings are not unknown, nor will they go without their recompense if trouble is a recompense for trouble. If the people neglect him, the government will not. If the government neglect him, the people will not, at least very long. Abigail would concur, writing in February of that year, he has acquired to himself by his writings, his abilities, and his general character for information, a reputation which his enemies fear and which cannot be combated by any imputation upon his life and manners. His son now seemingly fully ready, his vice president father attempted to give him a push in the right direction. One John Quincy rejected in April of 1794, writing to his dear old dad, "You recommend to me to attend the town meetings and make speeches, to meet with caucuses and join political clubs. But I am afraid of all of these things. They might make me a better politician and give me an earlier chance of appearing as a public man, but that would throw me completely in the power of the people, and all my future life would be a life of dependence. I had rather continue some time longer in obscurity and make some provision for fortune before I sally out in quest of fame or of public honors." But enough was enough, and it was in response to this letter that John Adams verbally slapped his son upside the head and wrote his famed, "The mediocrity of fortune that you profess or affect ought not to content you. You come into life with advantages which will disgrace you if your success is mediocre. And if you do not rise to the head not only of your profession, but of your country, it will be owing to your own laziness, slovenliness, and obstinacy." About a month later to Abigail, John Adams would once again write of the potential he saw in his son, and that others were starting to notice as well. His writings have given him a greater consideration in this place than he is aware of. I am sometimes told that I ought to be proud of him, and truly I don't want to be told this. He will be made a politician too soon, but he is a man of great experience and I hope sound philosophy. He was a greater statesman at 18 than some senators I have known at 50, but he must learn silence and reserve, prudence, caution, above all to curb his vanity and collect himself. Faculties or virtues that his father has often much wanted. I have often thought he has more prudence at 27 than his father at 58. 7 days later, as we noted in the beginning of this video, on May 26, 1794, John Quincy wrote to his father, "I think I have every day less ambition than the former to pursue a political career. In my profession, I trudge along without eminence and without total idleness. I see very few things in this life beyond the wants of nature that I desire, and whether it be philosophy or insensibility, I find myself contented with my state as it is." 3 days after this, John Quincy Adams' life would change forever, and because of it, world history. It had begun thanks to attacks on John Quincy's teenhood idol in George Washington. John Quincy Adams' outrage over this finally shook him out of his professional slumber. He was about to flex that incredible brain of his to fulfill the prophecy of his mother when she stated, "His enemies fear him." He had an intellect and a depth and breadth of knowledge few in the world could match, and a character carefully cultivated by his parents and himself that was on par. Thus, as she so sagely stated, there was nothing to attack in this case but his arguments, and few could stand toe-to-toe with John Quincy Adams in that arena even at this stage of life. For more on this saga, stay tuned to the next video in this series, The Secretary Foundations.